Hello, guys, and welcome to the first episode of Short Stories by my dad. So my dad is a very, very, very wonderful author, and he's not published, but he's written a few stories that I've read, and I absolutely loved them. And I decided that I wanted to narrate some of them because they're some of the best things I've ever read. I genuinely believe that he is this land's Stephen King. He is the Stephen King of this land, and that is the end of it. Um, but Um, well, this is the first short story of his that I'm gonna read here. So, Jebville.
The content presented in this video may not be suitable for all audiences. Viewer discretion is advised.
Where the hell is this place? Albright practically shouted at his own windshield. The windshield, perhaps with a touch of insolence, of course, said nothing. The elusive source of Wilson Albright's frustration was a town with the rather uninspiring name of Jebville, and it was obvious that its inhabitants were not interested in mingling among others. During the 2 days Albright had wandered this particular state of practically nowhere, he had found one person who even knew of its existence. The clear, yet still cryptic directions the old man had given were, head out of town on the 4-lane and turn right about the time the overpass comes in sight. If you get to the overpass, you done gone too far. So, turn around and come back to your first left. Head out that way till you see a big dairy barn on your right, and take a left on the road straight across from the barn. You can't miss it. It'll be a mile or so up the road, but you gotta look for it, 'cause they ain't right out on the road. Look for the red gate across the road with the sign that says Bigfoot Preserve. The last indicator had set the old boy off on a flinty-sounding cough, only haunted by a long drag from the cigarette apparently lit for the purpose. You best be careful, he'd said when the cough subsided. They don't much cotton to strangers up there. Albright could get no further information from him. Part of his irritation was being very good at his job, a big part of that job being finding people who didn't want to be found in places they were trying to hide. Wilson Albright was the one hired to find those whom the others couldn't, and 2 days spent searching a general area to locate an entire town was simply unacceptable. Asking questions left people to ask similar questions about you, and a big part of finding hidden people involved not letting them know you were looking. It was amazing the things that could go wrong if they found out you were coming in advance. A quick flash of red in the corner of his right eye made him suspect that he'd just missed the end of his search. His foot on the accelerator never twitched as he went by. He could turn the car around out of sight and come back, but he knew he would be hard-pressed to overcome the warning of sudden braking to anyone out on the lookout for strangers. His attention registered a tractor hitched to a wagon loaded with hay shortly after the eye catching red flash, so he had a marker for a more precise location. Nearly 2 miles farther down the road, he slowed and turned into a field entrance to reverse his course. Traveling at a more leisurely pace now, he watched for the entrance of the local Bigfoot Preserve to appear on his left, and about 100 yards past the tractor with its hay, his search was rewarded. The fashion of his reward left him completely without words. It was, indeed, a red gate, blocking an opening in a barbed wire fence. The entrance, assuming the opening of the gate, was to nothing more than a small open field of overgrown grass, sliced across by a narrow track of 2 parallel, not quite bare marks leading off the road into the thicket of dark pines which surrounded the small field. All he could do for now was mark the location in his memory and drive steadily back to the actual highway. Exploration of Jebville would apparently take more effort than driving in to look around. About 12 miles south of the Bigfoot Preserve, which he had been assured was the metropolis of Jebville, Albright stepped back into his room at the more easily located Dawn's Rest Inn. He spent most of the past 2 days searching for the elusive village, but he spent the balance in his room. The 2 days galled him, and being the caution purse he was, he began gathering his things to find a place where he'd hopefully not be seen. Having run through the remainder of the room, the last thing to catch his eye was the package on the table by the window. It was a plain white, sheet-sized envelope with no address or mark. Inside was a picture, a man with short, salt-and-pepper hair, wide nose, and heavy cheeks, all perched above a wide and erect set of shoulders. Written on top of the photo was a name, Jason Pickens, and across the bottom in large letters, Jebville. On the back of it was printed a map, most of 4 counties, somewhere in which would presumably lie both Jebville and Pickens. The 5 bundles of 20 $100 bills, each with the same telephone number inked across the band, had been removed from it and placed in a safer locale. Albright exchanged the key cards for the room for the envelope as he walked out the door and closed it behind him. The Motel 6 on the edge of Cordell, 8 to 10 miles north of his target, was perhaps more easily located than the more quaintly named Dawes Rest, being directly beside the main highway, but it was all the more anonymous for that. As Albright stepped through the door, "Good afternoon, sir. May I help you?" came from a bright and perhaps a bit overly chipper young man standing behind a tag bearing the name Doug. "That depends, Doug," he replied in a light, questioning voice. "Do you have a room, preferably on the end and ground floor?" Doug consulted his screen momentarily. "Yes, sir. We have 130, which is ground floor on the right end. It's a double." Albright allowed a smile to flick across his features with his response. "That would be fine." "Very good, sir." The clerk fished the paperwork from beneath the counter. "If you'll just fill this out and let me copy your His speech trailed for him momentarily as he noticed his customer passing both license and credit card across the counter and lifting the pen. "Thank you, Mr. Abel," he said, turning to his work. Albright filled out the paperwork in a well-practiced, efficient manner, then signed the credit slip and put it in his breast pocket while absently listening to Doug's explanation of the key cards from the room's location. He walked into room 130, placed 2 bags, a backpack, a duffel, both black, on the bed, and immediately turned on the air conditioner. It was hot. "Why can't these places ever have the air on?" he muttered briefly, but then ignored the discomfort as he pulled a laptop from his backpack and sat down at the table. Google Earth was an incredibly useful tool, Albright thought as a few touches brought the familiar satellite view to the screen. He brought the area into the wide view and followed the roads into the vicinity of that red gate. There was no street view available, he wasn't surprised to find out, but zooming the overhead allowed him to follow the narrow track back into the pine thicket. Quite some distance into its depth, the path seemed to end, and he zoomed the view as close as it could. Hidden away in this dim corner of nowhere, the close-up view showed him several buildings, clustered together, partially obscured by the close canopy of pine limbs. Something didn't exactly look right about the little place, but aside from the fact that it didn't actually look large enough to have a name, Albright couldn't put his finger on what that might be. "No wonder no one actually knew where it was," he muttered under his breath as he made note of the location and searched the surrounding woods for paths and obstacles. He soon shut down the computer and lay flat across the bed, sleeping soundly. It was 8 p.m. when he awoke, as Albright knew before glancing at the clock, and he came awake completely as his eyes opened. He stepped out the door within 10 minutes and walked next door for a bite to eat. His 6:30 omelet had nearly deserted him at this point. Sitting down at a table in the rear corner of the fast food haven, he disassembled the large burger and ate the meat and the few vegetable stand-ins, washed it down with the tea, and left the remnants in the sandwich wrapper. These he deposited in the can near the door and refilled the tea, taking the cup with him on the short walk back to his accommodations. Upon entering the room, he immediately opened the duffel bag, carefully removed a few items and laid them on the bed, then took a small plastic box from one end pocket and walked toward the shower, stripping as he went. He showered carefully and thoroughly, using nothing but the soap contained in the small box, then dressed in the clothes he'd placed on the bed. Within an hour of opening his eyes, he was sitting in the seat of the black Honda Element provided for this adventure and was back on the road to Jebville. Having studied the area on the computer, he struck the road on its far end this time, driving carefully in the direction of the intersection across from the dairy barn. The entire road was bordered by alternating fields or pines planted in rows, all radiating a somewhat confusing sameness under the light of the half-moon above. As he passed the field where he had turned around earlier, he began paying particular attention to the area on his left, carefully noting any features standing out from the surroundings. One of those features was the red gate itself, which Albright noticed now stood unlocked, with perhaps a foot of space between its end and the post to which it was closed. Soon reaching the end of the road facing the barn, he turned left after the briefest pause at the sign, stopping but displaying no hesitation. He went directly to a drive noticed on the map, which disappeared quickly into the forest, and turned in. A similar gate to the one defending Jebville, but rusted and sagging, lay across it, supporting a sign, proclaiming it the property of the Tall Rack Hunting Club, and another below it to let you know it was posted. Albright pulled the SUV as far into the brush on the right as he could, and sat in the stilled silence for a moment, adjusting himself to the dimness. The interior lights never came on as he exited the vehicle and opened the rear hatch. Albright flipped back the floor mat in the back and used a small key to open a compartment beneath it. Removing the items from it, he slipped quickly into a double-shoulder holster, which he covered with a black vest, all matching the cargo pants and long-sleeve shirt in which he dressed. He closed the hatch, pulled the brushy limbs around the back of the car, and strode towards the gate, adjusting the straps and vest as he went. It had been the existence of what he'd been sure was this camp road which had decided Albright on this angle of approach. Earth had shown him a small creek bottom running beneath the two roads bordering the Jebville area, cutting an angle behind it on the west and south. After only a short and relatively easy walk, he struck that creek and turned to follow it into the pines surrounding his target. Not wanting to show a light, Albright had a dark, difficult walk along the creek bank, and it was a little after 11 when he turned east away from the creek, hoping to approach the village from the back. It was even more difficult going after leaving the creek, but it was only a short time of careful travel before the sound of laughter and music came from ahead of him to the left. Moving in that direction, Albright soon saw a glimmer of lights through the dark woods, and exercised even more caution in his movement, making no sound at all. From what his aerial surveillance had shown him, he felt certain he had gone a little farther down the creek than he had intended, and was now approaching Jebville from the southwest rather than due west, and he circled slowly to his right, making better use of that angle. He soon struck a narrow path, too wide for a game trail, yet hardly noticeable in the almost non-existent lighting, leading in the direction of the apparent gathering. Given this slight sign of human presence, he crouched silently in the darkness, carefully searching his surroundings. It was the scent he noticed first, sharp and unpleasant, opposed to the rich smell of living pine and the dense aroma of decaying leaves which surrounded him. Cigarette odor stood in the stark contrast to the natural smells around him, and he turned slowly to face the almost imperceptible breeze stirring through the night. Several minutes of waiting was rewarded with a flicker of flame high and just a little to his right. This was followed by the flare of the coal and the cloying smell of the exhaled smoke. While the watcher in the tree enjoyed the smell and glow of his vice, Albright worked his way silently down 30 yards of the path which led to his left before slipping off it again when it curved away, holding instead a direct path toward the jovial gathering ahead. About 20 minutes later, Albright lay prone behind a falling tree, peering over at the village gathering before him. 11 people, all male, sat or stood talking and drinking beer in a large gazebo. Inside the gazebo burned a bright fire, and country music came, not too loudly, from a stereo on the far side. The gazebo was a bit odd for what appeared to be a simple hunting camp group spending a typical night by the fire, but it was the surrounding town itself that made the whole scene surreal. It was like stepping back in time for a century or so to a rural life that the greater world had long passed by. On the far side of the gazebo was a brand new country store, complete with rocking chairs and a bottle-capped checkerboard on the porch, which should have been gracing the center of a black and white photograph featuring men in overalls riding a wagon loaded with hay drawn by a mule team. Across the generally circular clearing marking the end of the cart path sat 2 small houses with more of those rocking chair ensconced porches, and between them was what appeared to be an outhouse. The reason all of this was so plainly visible and completing the dizzying unreality of the picture was the electric lighting which would have shamed any tourist luring downtown with its brightness. All of this came with no visible or audible source of power. While all of this only took moments to imprint itself on Albright's awareness, his primary attention centered on the people. All were fairly large, dressed in plain clothing of the sort you might expect from the type of countrymen who typically inhabited hunting camps everywhere. Despite the surreal village which surrounded them, their talk was loud and full of live women and dead animals, both seasoned with the good-humored boasting encouraged by such gatherings. What was missing here was the broad-shouldered man from the photograph. If he was in Jebville tonight, he was in one of the surrounding buildings, not partaking of the beer and companionship of the gazebo. Albright moved from his hide, working his way around to his left, back toward the creek to avoid crossing the road. The group enjoying themselves in the gazebo presented little or no threat to his concealment, but he moved quietly and maintained his vigilance into the woods, which he knew contained at least one watcher. The thought crossed his mind that Pickens himself could be the smoker in the trees, but until he exhausted the possibilities of the village center, he would not undertake the difficulty of a lone man on watch in the dark. His travels soon took him behind the store, where a jolt to his sense of reality struck. The store wasn't real. The porch was real, and the wall behind it, which appeared to be a storefront, was actually constructed. But it all ended there. Behind the country storefront lay a simple, cheap tin shed covering and a small tractor, and a four-wheeler of some sort. Covering the roof of the shed and glittering in the waning moonlight to which they remained exposed were solar cells to explain the otherwise inexplicable power. Albright's memory called up the satellite view which he had examined earlier, saw the shadow lying over the sparkling roof with the morning sun to the east. Now he could put his finger directly on what had been wrong and began taking pictures with a small camera from inside his vest. Continuing around the perimeter, another scent riding the light breeze soon told him that the outhouse, at least, was real. But it was already becoming plain that the quaint-seeming fronts of the houses were masked over the simple shed buildings behind them. The town, known by so few outside of it, appeared to not exactly exist at all. It was a movie-set village, appearing to be something that only used to be. Albright had never wondered about this job before, but why? Why would anyone live in what appeared to be a hunting camp camouflaged as a village, not on a map and left in the past? He continued taking pictures with the camera as he worked his way on around. Several small trails like the one in the woods had crossed into the camp center as he come around, and as he reached the small road back out to the gate, another met it on the far side. Albright froze in place. There was no mistaking the man slowly emerging from the path across the way. He wasn't very tall, but every inch was on display. The shoulders were wide and straight, and while the features of the face were obscured by darkness, the head was wide, slowly turning from this way and that, focusing his ears to catch any noise around him. He was completely on alert, and there was not a hint of smoke around him. Albright felt fortunate to have seen him and be on the downside of that weak breath of wind, because even now, still as a stone and listening, he couldn't hear a sound. Pickens stopped beside a large tree next to the road and stood, sensing. Albright was beyond good in the unlit trees, but he could see this man reaching into the dark forest around him to feel any disturbance to his sensory input. All he could do was pretend to be a tree and hope he was passed over. For one moment, it seemed that Pickens' senses crawled over him, and the man across from him seemed to look directly in his eyes, but then he slipped out of the trees and down the road itself like a ghost, moving toward the village. Albright stood perfectly still, watching the retreating figure and hoping to see him step into the village proper. For one moment there was a man-shaped silhouette against the light, but it disappeared, seeming to slip to the left around the edge of the open area toward the gazebo. He was shaken badly by the encounter, which was completely new to him, and he moved now up the road towards the gate, wanting to be free of these woods and away from the made-up village of Jebville. As he passed into the verge of the field by the gate, he noticed a sign of the opening into the trees beside the road. It said, "Beware of dog." It took Albright more than an hour to work his way around the roads to his parking place, avoiding 2 cars, and he backed quietly and without lights into the road just after 4 a.m. He took the road west, away from Jebville, and he waited until he could pull into the edge of a field a mile or so along to put the more incriminating clothing back into the hidden lockbox in the back. It seemed a long drive back to the Motel 6, and he didn't even wait to take a shower before falling asleep. Albright awoke just after 9, immediately stripping the dark clothes off and hitting the shower. 15 minutes of hot water and steam cleared his head, and turning the hot water off for a cold plunge afterward certainly left him awake. He dried and tossed on some clean clothes, then sat down with the computer to download his pictures from the night reconnaissance. He looked over them carefully, one at a time, every one confirming his memory of the strange little place. He sat back after the viewing and thought carefully, remembering details and taking notes on a pad beside the machine. As he did this, he rolled over in his mind the incredibly unnerving feeling brought on by his near contact with Pickens. Normally he would have exfiltrated back towards the woods, but he had been so disconcerted, no, admit it, he'd been frightened by his close call with his mark that he'd almost fled through the field, eager to get. It hit him that there had been no cars. He remembered the gate being slightly open as he drove by, going in. He worked his way along the edge of that field on the west side, getting out to the road. It was easily the size of a chain store parking lot, but it had been completely empty. He ran through the pictures again. The only vehicles of any sort he could find were the tractor and the four-wheeler in the shed behind the storefront. He downloaded the pictures to a file on a flash drive and attached the file to an email with no subject or introduction and sent it. He shut the computer down and the flash drive went into the duffel. He took a phone from the same pocket and turned it on. When it had booted, he dialed a number which answered without a ring and in a robotic voice and tone confirmed Mail 6. He then turned the phone back off and walked out of the room, heading up the street on foot to Waffle House to have breakfast for lunch. He ate slowly and strolled back afterwards, stepping back into the room around noon. He sat down with the computer when he walked in and signed into an email account. Albright opened the one note there and read it. Charlie Oscar November Tango Alpha Charlie Tango 2468. At it for a moment, repeating it aloud, then erased it and sat back. He switched on the phone from the bag once again, dialed, and simply said, "Will, done." The phone was turned off and placed in his pocket as he gathered his things to leave. It was 1 p.m. as he stepped into the lobby of the motel. He checked out as quickly as possible and pointed the element south. Within the hour, he sat in the car and nosed into the driveway, reading the sign, Bigfoot Preserve. The gate was closed and locked again, making it rather plain that visitors were unwelcome. He had a feeling that the best thing he could do here was just to wait, so he pulled off the driveway into the shade of a tree, opened all the windows, and killed the car to do just that. Black vehicles are hot. It was nearly 5, and Albright was certain he could have baked a pie in the back seat when a fairly new but rather dirty truck pulled into the drive. The driver and the passenger got out, and a boy who seemed in his mid-teens leaned over the cab and watched from the back. Neither of the men seemed armed, but nor did they look particularly friendly, as Albright stepped out to meet them with his hand out. "I'm William Abe, and I'm the passenger." Tall and somewhat scruffy in appearance, interrupted him. Old Tinker said there'd been someone asking around the past couple of days. "What we got here is a comfortable little closed club, and the only folks that come in are invited. I don't think you was invited." Albright withdrew the hand he'd extended as the man spoke and kept a close watch on the driver, who was slowly working his way to Wilson's right toward the gate as his friend spoke. The passenger completed his welcome, and Albright held him eye to eye. "Doesn't seem to me that I'm in yet, either," he said in a flat voice. It seemed like the polite thing to do would be to wait. This left the man momentarily unsure of himself, and his partner stopped moving to the flank, so Wilson went on. "Before I was interrupted, I was trying to ask if I might locate Mr. Jason Pickens." "I reckon you already have." The voice came from almost straight behind him. Albright managed to not flinch, barely, but both the men in front of him nearly leapt into the air, and the teenager disappeared behind the cab of the truck. He turned slowly and saw his nearly phantom companion from last night's adventure leaning casually against a fence post as though he'd been there all along. Without a word, the 2 men got in the truck, backed swiftly into the road, and left in the direction of the dairy. "Guess those 2 didn't want to come in today anyway," Pickens said amiably as they hurried away. "Never can tell about folks." He turned to look at Albright, and his eyes seemed to sparkle, hard and light even with the falling sun behind him. "They were right, though. Coming in here without leave is a bad idea." The brilliance of the eyes was unmistakable. "You were lucky." Remembering clearly that powerful feeling that Pickens had looked him straight in the eye last night, Albright had no doubt from such a statement that his presence was known. "How did you know?" "Son, some people own land and never see it. Others farm or hunt, maybe both. And they come to know the land and feel it around them. Others," here he nodded slightly at Albright, "just move with the land. They don't know it right down deep like those who live with it, but they feel its grain and way of life. Here, though," he gestured passively toward the area behind the fence, "I'm different. This ant owns and knows me, so it speaks to me. It let me feel you last night. Says you got reason here now." He moved towards the gate. He didn't walk exactly, he moved, managing a motion that somehow defied the senses. As he opened the gate roughly a foot, Pickens asked, "Would you like to see Jebville?" Albright stepped through the gate, and as Pickens closed it behind him, the light seemed to shimmer. It seemed that it faded a little or something. Much like the other man's movement to the gate, it defied the senses. He walked with Pickens down the narrow path, and as they neared the gap in the tree line, he noticed the height of the trees, their girth. These were big trees, and gave off an air of ancient things before the days of modern humans. And the forest opening, there remained the sign he'd noticed in his first flight, "Beware of the dog." And he asked about it. "Yeah, that dog," Pickens began. "Even the men who come here welcome worry over that one. He roams the woods and can't be caught. Might sound crazy, but I think he's a protective spirit, born to defend the trees since they can't defend themselves. He came here because this is the last of the old trees." He gestured around, calling Albright's attention again to the forest. Forest it had become now, in truth. In the short time they'd walked, the trees around them had become enormous, larger than any Albright had seen outside of old pictures. Long, straight trunks rose well over 100 feet to the first limb, off of bases broader than a man's height. He knew that these were trees that simply didn't exist anymore, and looked back at Pickens more stunned than questioning. Pickens was looking at him intently, saying nothing, and Albright realized that he had been rooted to the spot, staring around at the trees. "They are something, aren't they?" The pale glitter was back in his eyes as he spoke. "Come on down to the store and I'll get us a coat. You sit down and rock while I'll tell you the story." Together they resumed the walk in silence, and the sun slanted sharply from the west as they strolled into the village of Jebville. It had changed. Albright looked around at the few houses and saw the track on which they had entered disappearing into the forest beyond the store. Jebville General Merchandise, as its sign declared. As he watched, a man came out the door, dressed in bib overalls over a stained white shirt. The man walked back in the direction of the gazebo, which sat to the left of the road in a grassy area, climbed on the battered remains of an old buggy pulled by a mule, and vanished into the forest along a narrower trail beyond it. You see him a good bit, but they never have anything to say. Albright looked up to see Pickens, holding a cold, dripping bottle in each hand, staring somewhat sadly in the direction of the little trail. He punched the ring in one of the tops and popped the bottle open, handing it to Albright, who wasn't sure he could hold it. These bottles sat encased in museums these days, not in wet ice boxes sealed and full of soda. Come on up and have a seat before you fall. He helped Albright stumble up onto the porch to collapse in one of the rockers, then sat in the other beside him, taking a long pull at the Coke in his hand. I got a hold of this place years ago, more from luck than anything else, Pickens began after his drink. Old man who owned it was from an ordinary old cuss. Land had been in his family since about the time God laid it down, but he was the last one. Not having anybody to leave it to, and being so damn mean he couldn't sell it, he wound up selling it to me for practically nothing, just because I lived on the other side of it from him. Since everyone hated him anyway, he didn't want any of your neighbors to worry with, you see. Take a drink, son, it ain't whiskey, which might be a little better, but it'll do you some good anyway. Albright took a drink of the Coke. It was cold. Ice cold, sharp and sweet. It was perfect. So he drank again and waited for Pickens to continue. There seemed to be more salt than pepper in the hair now, he noticed. It seemed right to think old man about him in his head. Pickens looked at him like he was reading his mind. It happens here. He looked away and kept going. Anyway, I got a hold of this place for cheap, with no real purpose for having it. I made a few little trails through it, but I didn't want to tear it up. I liked the wild feel to it. That's where things start to get interesting. He paused to swallow the last of his Coke, and set the bottle on the table. I had a grandson, see. He was young and energetic, but curious, and always wanting to learn and know. I started building this stuff. He gestured around at the village, so he could get some sort of idea how things were, how they used to be. He looked a bit wistful. You saw the place last night. It's just a drawing made out of lumber. Just a picture. I reckon it worked, though. He sat up again as he spoke. We'd walk down here and talk about the old days. We talked about when I was young. We talked about the stories my granddaddy told me when I was young. We talked about a lot. He looked now at the trees around them. It was them that first caught my attention, the old man said. They grew. When I came down by myself, or just an old crony, they were just scrappy little pine trees. With that boy, though, they were more. They felt like old pine trees. I just kind of passed it off, though. I couldn't let myself believe anything was different for real, just living in the old times in our heads as we spoke. He paused for a moment here. Albright had time to notice the length of the shadows across the ground before the old man continued, catching him again in the tail. One day, though, me and grandson were just talking old stories like usual, when he just excused himself and walked through that door behind you. Wasn't but a minute, and he walked back out, carrying one of these. He lifted his empty bottle in his hand just as natural as you please. He sat down and took a drink, just like it was perfectly common to get a cold, century-old Coke out of a tractor shed and drink it. I suppose he noticed me using my chin whiskers for a porch broom, because he asked me right quick, "You okay, Grandpa? Sorry, I didn't ask, but you want me to get you a Coke?" I wasn't even sure what to answer. He looked away again, caught up in the memory. Rather than answer, I just got up and looked in myself. Inside was a quiet little country store, just like the front looks. I didn't get a Coke then, but I didn't have much more to say neither. I let the young'un finish his drink, and we rode out on the wheeler like always. His speech seemed to grow slower and gain a heavier drawl the more he spoke. I haven't seen him since. The light around them had grown dim, but the sky glowed a pale orange color, like a peach above the canopy of the giant trees. I came back myself the next day. I parked the wheeler by the gate and walked in like we did just now, noticed the trees as soon as I walked in among them. He gestured around again. They weren't little second or third growth pines anymore. They were ancient trees. They were trees that might have seen anything, and maybe times when there was nothing to see. It was a staggering experience. He looked Albright over pretty hard. as I think you've seen this evening. I walked down and looked inside the store. The old man picked up the thread of his tale. It was easy to see him as old. His hair was white and his face wrinkled, but he sat straight and his eyes were clear and sharp. If anything, he looked stronger than in his younger appearance. I did have a Coke that day. It was just like you've had here this evening, cold and sweet. It reminded me of being the grandson rather than the grandfather, but it was getting late, and I walked back up the trail. Albright thought Pickens looked deadly serious as began again. As I was nearing the opening from the woods, I heard the baying of some deep-voiced hound. I'd never heard anything like it before. It seemed to both rumble and scream, shaking the ground and shattering your ears. I looked back and saw the dog. He's a huge beast, bigger than any wolf. His eyes flared red and his muzzle glowed like bright moonlight on ruffled water. I suppose I don't need to say that I ran. I ran like Satan himself was chasing me, because for all I knew, he was. I made it up to the wheeler and fell across it, looking back as I tried to catch my breath and slow my pulse, feeling squeezed like I was in a vice. The hound stood at the opening of the trail, which is where I got my best look at him. He threw back his head and howled, sounding like every wolf ever spawned in one voice. It was terrible. He took a deep breath and went on. I made it back to the driveway at home on the wheeler. I felt like my chest was clamped in a huge fist and I couldn't drag air into my lungs no matter how hard I tried. I fell off just short of the porch and the wheeler ran into the wall. I remember Lucy screaming for me and then waking up with tubes and lines everywhere else you can think of attached. That's all. Silence fell. The light in the sky had faded to a pale, luminous blue, but beneath the trees it was dark. Pickens looked his age now, but strong and straight without fear. I woke up here, thinking that you likely know what that means. I tried to leave a time or two at first, but as soon as I'd passed the gate, I'd find myself back here. I suppose the family leased the place to that bunch of hunters because they had less use for it than I had. They come in and drink, play some cards, and even shoot a deer every now and then. I let 'em in, of course. When you show up and the gates open a little, you're invited to come in, and I guess that's my job. You do okay here during the day, but at night, it's anyone's guess as to where that beast might be. If you stay here at night, it's best to stay here, in town. The final light had faded, and it was deeply dark amid those ancient trees. They creaked and groaned, swaying in the breeze and calling in their archaic voices. That's why the people who sent you don't matter much, Pickens said in a direct and clear voice, much different than the vocal construction he'd adopted for the storytelling. Albright stared for a moment, not understanding. He was enraptured by both story and setting, removed from the world of which he'd been a part. What? He gasped out in a dazed shock. You don't know exactly who sent you, or why. I know, though. I know a lot of things these days. They want something that I don't have, never did have. I couldn't give it to them now if I did. Either way, you've got a choice to make here. He looked intently into Albright's eyes, his own glowing like full moons. A deep, shuddering howl broke out in the distance, low amidst the soft voices of the trees. What choice is that? He asked, although the howl in the darkness made it plain. Boy, the old man next to him intoned, you're welcome to sit here with me each night in the village. Or you can make a run for the gate and hope you get the chance to pass along to your employers the fact that I wouldn't take the phone and hear what they've got to say. If you run, though, you'll be trespassing. And you've got to watch that dog. Albright was caught like a rabbit in the headlights. This was crazy. He was sitting out on the front porch of a tractor shed, drinking a Coke with his Mark, who turned out to be a reject from the nut house with a canine fixation. He turned and walked down the steps, striding purposefully across the village on his way back to the car. Good luck, boy, Pickens called from the porch. Be careful out there and come back when you can. I'll let you in. Watch that dog. His voice faded as Albright strode into those great trees. The baying, both deep-throated yet high-pitched, broke out to his right almost immediately. Albright ran. He was in good shape, but it was a long way to the gate, and there was no holding back. The hound broke out on the trail behind him, just as the opening to the field came into sight, closing fast. Albright pushed, searching for that last burst of speed to carry him through the trees. Pickens reached across the table to Albright and handed him another Coke. You're probably out of breath, aren't you? Have a drink, boy. I told you to watch that damn dog.